Hey everybody, welcome back to class and welcome to module number 9, childhood abuse and neglect. And so I hope that you're doing well, hope that you're navigating your way again through the classroom. We are almost to the end of our modules after the next couple of weeks or so. And so we're moving right along and we come now this week to module number 9. I want to just kind of summarize for you as I do normally in these little mini lecture videos, just some key points out of the lecture notes that I want to just kind of draw to your attention. So in addition to not just reading the information, you can also kind of hear it from me as well too. Occasionally students are surprised in this class. When we come to this module, they sometimes when they sign up for a class called Problems of Children and Adolescents, they don't always think or anticipate that we might talk about child abuse or child neglect. But unfortunately, it is a key issue that we deal with at all levels of the social services system, no matter where you and I work, even if you don't work with kids. You need to be familiar with the reality. And again, all of us are already hopefully familiar with the reality, unfortunate reality, that we kind of live in a world where, again, kids are often at risk of being harmed either by abuse or by neglect. Sort of a sad statistic is this, and we have not kept statistics of child abuse and neglect in our country since the 1970s, and that may seem like a long time to some of you, but for others of us of certain ages, the 70s may not seem like that long ago. That's when we began to take and keep track of the statistics of child abuse and neglect in our society was in the 1970s, and now we are here in the 2020s. And would it shock you if I were to say to you that the rates, the consistency of child abuse and neglect has remained constant? It has not gone up dramatically. It has not gone down dramatically. Since the time we began tracking abuse and neglect with all of our technology, with all of our advances, with all of what we understand about family dynamics and caring for kids, today, consistently, we have a consistent number of children who are abused and neglected. And this is one of those topics that's not always easy for us to talk about, but it's one of those topics that we need to just talk about. So this module is devoted to a topic that may not be easy to consider. Some of the videos that I've posted for you, I don't think any of them are offensive in any way, but they may be a little hard to watch. I've got some news stories queued up for you to kind of look at. And sometimes when we look at those stories, are hard for us. So it's hard for us to consider the idea of children being abused and neglected, and teenagers as well too. But like I said, it's a very, very important part of the social services field. So I always make sure I cover and highlight this chapter out of our textbook. The term maltreatment is a term we also sometimes use when we think about the issue of child abuse and neglect, and that's kind of the focus then for this week. So let me do this. Let me just kind of highlight for you some of what I have listed for you in the module. So number one, the term abuse and the term neglect are two important terms that really are legal terms. They have legal definitions, and so part of what we follow in the social services field is we follow the legal definitions of what does our law in our nation say equals abuse, and what kind of behavior and what kind of activities or what kind of omissions, sort of neglecting kids, what kinds of things equal neglect. So understanding those different definitions is really, really important. So I'll give you some of those as well too. Abuse and neglect oftentimes occur together, but they're two separate kinds of experiences that kids can experience. And again, as the author of your textbook highlights, and I'll highlight here for you here for just a second, a lot of what we've talked about so far in this class have really been more like mental health, like diagnoses or developmental disorders, where you kind of diagnose a child as having this problem or whatever it may be. Well, child abuse and neglect is not a disorder or a diagnosis. It's not something that a child struggles with. It's something that happens to them. So that kind of makes this module a little bit different and a little bit interesting for that reason. And under the ideas of abuse and neglect, we have sometimes these different categories. And I mentioned, and I kind of summarize a few of those. In your module this week, I really focus mostly on physical neglect, but there's also what's called educational and emotional neglect. And sometimes those are kind of interwoven with each other. And sometimes there's even what's called medical neglect. And so sometimes neglect can look a number of different ways. Primarily what we focus on in our module is what's called physical neglect. And so I'm not going to summarize that here for you. You can go and look in your lecture notes. That is what it says it is, basically. And so we have different forms of ways in which kids can be neglected. But the main one that we see is what's called physical neglect. And then under the umbrella of abuse, there's physical abuse, there's sexual abuse, there's psychological abuse, and there's what's called emotional abuse. And I kind of focus on the first two, physical and sexual abuse, because those are the two most common that we see happening to children and teens. And oftentimes there's an interweaving of both abuse and neglect. And so I give you some definitions, I give you some statistics, I give you some trends, I give you some examples of what that looks like. And then I also, too, in this module, I give you a lot of information. For example, I want you to be looking as you read through the notes. I talk a little bit about why do kids, why are kids abused and neglected? What are some risk factors among adults? Now, not every single child is abused or neglected, or child or teenager by an adult. Sometimes they can be abused, especially physically or sexually, by another child or teenager. But in most instances, adults are involved. When kids are abused and neglected, adults are involved. So I give you some information about what we know about some factors related to adults. Why do adults abuse kids, or why do adults neglect kids? I also talk a little about some child risk factors. What are some factors within children or childhood that we know can make them more susceptible, although it's not their fault? What are some of those risk factors, like age, for example? The younger a child is, the more likely they are to be abused or neglected. Physical and medical disabilities. If a child has a physical or medical or intellectual disability, they're at higher risk to be abused, and those kinds of things. So I give you some information about that. I also talk about families. I talk a little bit in this section, this module, about some of the family factors that we know. Now, abuse and neglect can happen really in any family. But we know that there are, just from our research and just from our experience, we know that there are some family structures, some family systems, some family dynamics that, if those things are present, it just makes it more likely, makes a child or a teenager more susceptible to be abused or neglected. So I list some of that for you in your notes as well too. And then I give you some information, lots of information about trauma, and lots of information about the effects of child abuse and neglect, some potential effects that it can have both on children and on teenagers. We talked in the last, I believe it was the last module, a couple of modules back, we talked about anxiety disorders. We talked about post-traumatic stress disorder that kids and adults can experience. Since this class is talking specifically about kids and teenagers, let's just talk about that for just a second. So trauma can look a bunch of different ways. Kids can experience trauma because they can go through a natural disaster, or they can go through an accident, or near-death experience. But many kids experience trauma through neglect and abuse, unfortunately. And so I give you some more information in this module, a little bit about what are some of the potential effects that abuse and neglect can have on people. I know many of you want to be social workers and counselors, and you want to be CPS workers, or drug and alcohol counselors, or whatever it may be. And so for that reason, I give you some examples. Some of it is probably stuff you already know, but just kind of highlight for us, what are some of the potential negative effects that abuse and neglect can have on kids long term. Now, one of the things I also want to highlight for you before we end this little video is this. I like how your textbook authors also highlight in the textbook reading, I ask you a question on your homework about resiliency, because we also know that kids are resilient. And so kids, especially kids and teenagers, even when they experience lots and lots of things in their lives, they have the capacity and the ability oftentimes to overcome those. And maybe some of you have had that experience in your own life. And so I don't want it to be all the negative, because I do give you a list of several negative potential effects that abuse and neglect can have on kids and teenagers. But resiliency is also an important thing to also keep in mind as well too. So, as I said at the very beginning of the video, not always an easy lecture, not always an easy module to work your way through, but I want you to be informed. I want you to be knowledgeable. One of the reasons why, in my opinion, one of the reasons why certain things continue in our culture is because of lack of information. That's not always the case, but that's often the case. One of the reasons why unhealthy, negative things continue in our world often is because people are not informed. And that's, in my experience, a common denominator in abuse and neglect. We want to look the other way. We don't want to deal with kids being hurt or abused or neglected. And what happens, unfortunately, by us looking the other way is we then remain uninformed. And so because we remain uninformed, things can kind of continue. So I think it's always good. One of the great things about being a college student is you can have your awareness raised of all of these different kinds of issues, including this one, as a way for us to then become knowledgeable so that we can teach and train others, so that we can be careful about our own attitudes and our own behavior, so that we can then help others who have been abused and neglected. And we can speak up sometimes and stand up and advocate for those who have no voice. So being educated, being informed is very, very important anyways in this field, especially as professionals, and especially around certain issues. And this is a big one. Child abuse and neglect is one of those issues that it's good for us to be knowledgeable and informed of. So go through and look at your lecture notes. do your discussion question, do your homework. I will see you next module. Have a good one.